Okay, it is 11 o'clock Pacific time on the dot. So I'm going to get started. We got a lot to cover. Welcome to today's live session on remote work. We have been, over the last 3 years, many of these organizations we've worked with at Xenium, including ourselves, we were thrust into a remote work environment, and now it's kind of moved to a hybrid, as I'm sure many of you are in that situation. So we, over the years in consulting with our clients and giving them best practice advice and experiencing it ourselves, and even in me, I've had many conversations with people on our podcast, Transform Your Workplace, over the last 3 years on remote work. And we've sort of developed a really good understanding about what makes remote work and even a hybrid environment successful. So today we thought we'd share some of those secrets with you. We boiled it down to 5 areas, and we're going to get into it. We've got a lot to cover this 45-minute webinar, so let's get going. Little housekeeping items for you. Presentation, we'll have Lacey and Annie talk for about 25 minutes in these 5 areas. We'll have a Q&A session for 20 minutes, and we want to make this interactive too. So we got to get through the sections, of course, but as you think of questions, use the Q&A. So there's two areas. There's the chat and Q&A. Use the Q&A for a question that you might have that you want to pose to Lacey, Annie, or myself, and use the chat if you're prompted, like with feedback, comments, ideas, or even things that you're doing inside your organization that you would be willing to share with all the other attendees. So use those 2 functions that way. This is going to be recorded. So a lot of you want to share it with your teams as you get value from this, or you have to jump off early for another call or a meeting. This is going to be recorded, so no worries there. We'll send it to you probably a few hours after the webinar takes place. And then we've got tons of content that's on demand and readily available for you. So go to xeniumhr.com/blog. You'll find 425 episodes of the podcast, tons of videos, lots of blog posts, downloads, templates, you name it. So go there, tons of free content for you. All right, let's get going. By the way, I'm Brandon Laws. I'll be your moderator for today. I am Xenium's marketing leader, and I host our podcast, Transform Your Workplace. So go check that out. I know many of you listened to that show, so thank you for that. Today's speakers, I've got Annie Oxenfeld. She's one of our director of HR services. Annie has a unique perspective. So Annie is obviously a consultant for many of our small and medium-sized organizations that we support. So she talks to her clients about remote work, but Annie's out of North Carolina. So she's 3 hours ahead of many of us at Xenium. So she offers a unique perspective as a consultant and as an employee. So she's got a lot to offer you today. So we're glad to have Annie. And Lacey Partapillo, she's our senior director of client success. She's been at Xenium almost as long as I have, almost 15 years. And she's a valuable team member to us. She was also willing to take a stab at the first episode of Transform Your Workplace, and we talked about employee handbooks all those years ago. So Lacey's always my go-to for webinars and all that, and so we're glad to have Lacey here. So let's get into it. We got a lot to cover. Lacey's gonna give us the first secret. What is it, Lacey?
So our first secret is the importance of onboarding and that initial training for our employees. So when we think about, onboarding and training for new hires, I think it can be difficult because many of us pre-pandemic were really used to that face-to-face interaction that we had. That has gone away. Many employers are now either in some sort of hybrid or a fully remote environment. And so when you think about how do you get your new hire that you've invested all this time during the recruiting process, how do you get them acclimated to the organization? I think the first thing, and honestly, this is like one of the basics in literally everything related to people practices, it's how your managers engage with people. So making sure that your supervisors and your managers that are participating in that onboarding process, that they understand the importance of it and what their role is. So really clearly defined roles and responsibilities, particularly for supervisors. I think thinking about just the process overall, who's going to be involved, paying attention to those nuances. And, you may need to adjust if you've got folks that are fully remote, some in office, some hybrid, you may have 3 different types of onboarding processes to think through. So if you're an HR practitioner, that's something to be thinking about. That orientation strategy, I think, is also really important. That first impression that the employee has with either HR Could be participating with other folks in the organization. I know at Xenium, one of the things that we do is have employees interact with multiple members of the leadership team. So making sure that we've made that accessible virtually for employees, making it easy for people to access the resources that they need, and making sure that we're really clear in that orientation, who to go to for what. And then the training strategy. So this is important because if we're, getting new employees the skills that they need to do their job, we have to think about how are we physically going to be able to do that? Does that look like Teams or Zoom meetings where we've got folks shadowing? I know we've incorporated some of that. Maybe there's some recordings that we have to do, some virtual trainings that we've built out that can be replicated and watched on demand. So I would just say thinking through that strategy for how each individual role is going to get that information is really important. One thing to think through, and some of you may be doing this, I'd be curious, throw it in the chat if you've implemented something like this, but some type of buddy, mentor, making sure that there's a connection for that new hire. So this is a different person than the supervisor, right? So could be a peer, could be somebody in a totally different department. I think that's neat because they get exposure to other, facets of the business that they might not otherwise, but somebody they can go to. Maybe it's for 60 days, maybe it's for 90 days, maybe it's just once a month, something that they can, they can connect with that person on a one-on-one basis to either get questions answered, to just build a relationship with. I think that's really nice. And we've implemented that at Xenium, and I think it's been really successful. I actually was a mentor for one of our new employees, and it was rewarding for me. So if you think about your employees that are existing, that aren't coming into the organization, it can add value and help retain them and secure those folks to the business, makes them feel like they're giving back. Regular check-ins, I mean, that's kind of basic. I think you increase the frequency of those during those first 90 days. So if you're just doing monthly one-on-ones with employees, I'd say we increase that. Maybe it's weekly for the first month. Obviously making yourself more accessible than that, because depending on the job, the employee may have questions every day. So making sure that the supervisor has made themselves accessible. And then we're measuring and tweaking, right? Getting feedback from employees. How's this going? What's working? What's not? I think that the supervisor or even HR finding moments to check in, touch base, and get feedback about how it's going for them. And then I think we pivot, right? So we're all still learning. We all kind of got thrown into this hybrid remote environment. And I know we have kind of iterated on the processes and things that we're doing here at Xenium, and many of the clients that we work with are doing the same. So we're kind of all feeling this like pause. I feel like we got through the last 2.5 years. We're now sort of trying to figure out, okay, what worked from there? What can we retain? And what do we need to fix and grow on? And I think your new hires can actually participate and share some of that feedback. So the second secret that we want to talk about is the importance of communication and collaboration. So this is for everybody. I would say not just your new hires, but if you think about setting somebody up for success, you've got a remote employee that's just starting or an existing employee. We want to think about, how are we communicating with them? How are we bringing people together? How are we collaborating? When we all went remote in 2020, it felt like things it was immediate, it was sudden. We all sort of figured it out, but I think companies have decided, what's working for them and trying to figure out, what resources and things that they need. So the hardware is something to think about. So we want to make sure that we're thinking creatively about the physical things that employees need. And it's going to be different based on the role. So I have some tech clients that I've worked with, and they've got to have really advanced and fancy computer systems for those folks. If you've got somebody who's working in a support role, maybe in a customer service position, they might need something like a really advanced headset. So what I would say is, when you're thinking through the hardware that employees need, you need to come up with collaborative tools, but make sure that it's specific to the job. I'm curious, folks, feel free to put this in the chat. How many of you are offering stipends for home office equipment? I think this is a creative way to think about providing employees the tools that they need for home, because not everybody needs the same thing. Some of us have home offices. Some of us are working from the dining room table, right? So I did that for the beginning of the pandemic. I wasn't totally set up at home. So having that stipend allows employees to be able to access the resources and the things that they need specific for them. Maybe somebody needs a desk. Maybe somebody wants some extra monitors because their job requires that they've got kind of that dual monitor setup. I would do that so that employees have the ability to set themselves up for success. All right, so it's not just the hardware, right? So we've got to think about the software that folks are using to collaborate. So that could look different for, some organizations are using Teams, some are using Zoom, some folks have Slack. I've seen a wide variety of software tools to keep employees connected. I think what's nice about some of those is that you can create channels or groups so that information can be shared for that specific group. So we're not sending out things across, the all company email that maybe doesn't apply to everyone. I think it helps folks stay connected to their coworkers. It helps senior members of your team actually step up, sharing information, mentoring folks. So I'd be curious if folks are using any tools like that or other tools. Actually, I haven't heard of any other ones, but I know there's a lot of new technology out there that's helping folks stay connected and build relationships. I think we think about, these tools need to also be effective for the business. So, I think about the things that we have developed here at Xenium to be able to stay connected with clients and new things that we've implemented that we weren't doing before. And so finding ways to implement software and technology that's going to bring remote employees together, I think is the key, and then really increase that efficiency and integrate the teams together. You want to make sure you have the support, though, to manage programs like this. So a lot of this is going to fall on your IT teams. You may have a tech team there. Either way, you want to make sure that you've got the resources for those employees to be able to access support and training if they need it. So the thing I always think about with technology, though, is the boundaries have been really blurred for those of us that are working remote. So the fact that you're in your home office and you have a 2-minute commute to the kitchen to start working on dinner when your day is over, that makes it tough. So I think managers can do a lot of things to help employees with this. That could be, just being a good example, a role model of not working late into the evening, setting some buffers for yourself between work and life. For me, that was doing daycare drop off for my kiddo in the morning, like just the 5-minute drive to daycare made a difference. It wasn't the same commute that I had before, but was a little bit of a break, and implementing even things like that you might be able to do at the end of your day. So taking a walk, those like 5-10 minute little breaks that we can take between, the middle of our day, I think can make a big difference. And I have actually found when I do that, when I come back, I'm a lot more focused. Just staring at a screen is not actually healthy for us. So if you're a fully remote employee, if you think about 8 hours a day, you are staring at your computer screen, that's not good for the eyes. It's not good really for anything. So finding ways to take those breaks in the middle of the day, I think, is important. And even doing some of those with your colleagues, whether that's, we've done some Peloton bike rides in the middle of the day with a few of us that have bikes. It could be taking a walking meeting instead of like sitting at your desk and doing a Teams meeting, actually having a phone call, because it's so different from what we were doing before. I think it makes a big difference. So managers should hopefully be setting good examples, and HR obviously sending out reminders to folks about how this is important too, I think is a good deal.
Before we get into this next secret, I wanted to just acknowledge that I accidentally did not enable the chat feature in advance of this. So I apologize. I did want this engagement, but only the Q&A feature is enabled. So if you have questions or feedback, use that and we'll answer it live in a moment. All right. Third secret.
Awesome. Third secret. So we want to talk about performance and feedback, which is really important in any work environment, regardless of whether it's remote or not. We've got a lot of great content and training on that, but today we wanted to focus on some specific elements to the remote or hybrid environment. So with your feedback, we really want that to go both ways and be intentional about asking about the remote experience. So getting input from your team on a regular basis about how they're feeling in the remote workplace. Do they feel connected to the team? Do they need additional equipment or support to do their best work? Like Lacey mentioned, how is that work-home balance going? giving feedback about what they might need to adjust is important as well. So sometimes we see people's performance improving when they're working at home. Sometimes they get more distracted. So giving feedback about their availability, their response time, their work quality. Do you see them sending emails at every hour of the night? That might be something to figure out about what's going on there. So those are important things for the feedback piece. I do think with remote work, we need to get a little bit more creative with some of our feedback, especially recognition. So I think sometimes it takes a little bit more effort just because we have less visibility to each other. So I would ask, and I think we can use the Q&A function for this, but just what are some of your favorite ways that you like to recognize your remote employees? I think there's been some really cool developments recently of different platforms. There's one called Hey Taco that you can incorporate with a Slack channel for giving kudos. Making sure that you acknowledge little things like small wins, birthdays, anniversaries, if they had, an important meeting on their calendar, kind of making sure you're asking about that. So really those opportunities for someone to feel seen, because being remote, that's harder to do. And then thinking about what that experience is like too, of how would I do this if I were in person, and then trying to mimic that. So an example would be if you would normally take someone out to lunch for a performance review meeting, sending them a DoorDash gift card or some kind of treat to differentiate that conversation from just your regular Zoom meetings. If you haven't already, I think moving away from your annual performance review cycle towards more regular intentional check-ins. I think monthly one-on-ones are really important. I think, if we can do some sort of quarterly goal setting, that helps keep people engaged as well. Can be harder to identify poor performance or issues that are happening in a remote environment. So making sure that you define what good behavior is, what good performance is, that it's really clear, because most of your employees want to do a really good job, but if they don't know what that means, then it can be demotivating. So making sure that you're being really clear about that. And then shifting away from this kind of mentality around butts and seats as productivity. I think especially at home, we need a little bit more flexibility to kind of, like Lacey said, get out of the screen. So shifting from, time spent at work and moving towards outcomes, and what are we hoping for folks to achieve? What are their goals? And really helping them understand the why can give them a sense of purpose in their role and help them be more productive. Our fourth secret is inclusivity and engagement. I think this is one of the most important considerations for your remote workers. It extends to hybrid work as well. And I think we're just kind of scratching the surface here. So I would ask to share in the Q&A what inclusion strategies have worked well for your organization. So a couple of things that come to mind for me, especially in hybrid environments where you have multiple types of participants in a meeting, where you have some in person and some virtual. I think it's really important to make sure you have your tech right. You've got the camera facing a presenter. If there's a presenter, you've got the sound settings. The meeting is set to start on time. I personally ask my colleagues, if there's like a conference room or small group meeting, to all log in individually into the virtual platform so that I can see their faces. The difference that makes for me is, instead of seeing a blurry conference room where I feel like I'm observing the meeting, I actually feel like I'm at the table inside the meeting. So that's something you can do. I think making sure that your remote employees get the same perks as in-person employees, which doesn't necessarily mean an apples to apples comparison, because some things we just can't replicate in a remote environment. But one example could be if you're having a lunch catered for an event or a meeting, making sure that your remote employees can get that their lunch taken care of for that day. They can order in or something. One that was personal to me at Xenium, our employee engagement committee called Excite, they hosted an event that was a Xenium pretzel day, where they had hot pretzels and different toppings and stuff like that. It sounded really fun. I was super touched that day, like the exact day that was happening in the office. I got a package in the mail that had like a make your own pretzel kit. It's obviously not the same experience, but I felt really included. I felt seen, I felt a part of it, even though I couldn't be there in person. So that's an example. One thing that I've seen work really well with our clients who span multiple time zones, so East to West Coast, is establishing a set of core working hours. So some block of time, usually in the middle of the day, whether that's 5 or 6 hours, that kind of spans multiple time zones where everybody is expected to work in that core zone, can be really helpful. And then outside of that, people have discretion in terms of if they want to work later or earlier than that core working hours. But it makes sure that people have the flexibility that works for their lifestyle, but we also can engage with each other, make sure we have availability to have meetings and collaborate and get the work done. And then don't forget about team building. This one sounds obvious, but I think, we all kind of got a little burnt out with the virtual happy hours. Right when the pandemic started, we were on Zoom 8 hours a day, and then we had this happy hour to go to. But there's some really creative things out there that I would encourage you to research and think about, that you could either host yourself or work with a company who specializes in that. So some examples would be like virtual trivia or virtual escape rooms. Use your tech, use chat channels for connection, not just getting the work done. Think about the opportunities that you have with like water cooler talk or passing each other in the hall, and what can you do to kind of replace that in a remote environment. And then for your policies and expectations, I do think it's important to design some guidelines or expectations just so everyone's on the same page. We did see some studies recently that indicate that hybrid workers are the happiest, which I found really interesting, because when we're consulting, we hear a lot of clients saying their employees want to be 100% remote. And there could be some really good valid reasons for why they want that. But it is interesting. There are some statistics that kind of back up having at least some in-person engagement, because you get that flexibility to work from home as well as the kind of morale boost from being in person. So if you have that type of environment, I think it's just really important to design those expectations around a purpose and be able to explain the why. Employees don't like feeling like they have to come into the office just to check a box. I've got to put on my uncomfortable pants and battle traffic and figure out what is lunch. I can't just open my fridge. So I think if they're coming there and they're sitting there by themselves in the office, that can be demotivating and really kind of question what's going on here. So if you can schedule those in-person requirements or guidelines around things that have meaning, like meetings or group lunches or some kind of purpose, and you can explain what that is, I think you'll get more buy-in from your employees. So I would say, if you could put in the Q&A, what is your why for wanting people to work in person on those days when they do? And then with your policies, I think, it's important to be flexible. So we don't want to do something that's super rigid, because there's always going to be times when we may need to ask people to be more in person than other times, or there could be specific positions that require that. So, mail clerk or receptionist, things like that. So, yeah.
Okay, so we can't do a training here without talking a little bit about compliance. I don't think it's like the end all be all, but having remote workers and understanding the regulatory environment that we are in right now is complicated. So if you receive our compliance around the corner newsletter every 2 weeks, that hiring people remotely, even just in a different county right now, is complicated. So and it is like constant and ever changing that new regulatory requirements are coming out. And I think it's really, really important that you have someone within your organization that is responsible for ensuring that from a people perspective, an employee perspective, we've got our I's dotted, T's crossed when it comes to compliance. And that looks like, making sure that we have workers' compensation for all of our employees, that making sure that we've got our posters up, that if there are required notices for hiring employees, that we've provided those. Some states have requirements around notices that are given upon hire or upon termination. So keeping track of those things is complicated and can be honestly really overwhelming. And so I'm really proud of the regulatory compliance information that we are providing to our clients, because I don't know how else folks could keep up. But making sure that you've got updated handbooks. Most states have, unique policies that are required to be provided to employees. So we want to make sure that we're set up to provide those things to our employees, and that we're withdrawing the appropriate taxes. So when I said things are even by county different, I mean, we're seeing even local municipal taxes being required. And so making sure that the payroll platform that you're working with is set up correctly to withdraw that, and that you're paying attention, keeping up to date on at least the locations that you've got employees currently working in. When you're communicating to employees, I think we have to think about, where do our remote employees live and work? Making sure that we've got good ways to communicate new and updated policies, that we're, to Annie's point, tracking performance, making sure that we're holding folks accountable. Just because they're home doesn't mean that they're working any less hard. I think there's been a stigma around that for a long time. And I think one of the blessings maybe of the pandemic is that has changed a little bit. Making sure if you've got folks that are working from home and they're using VPN or other means to log into your system, that things are secure, that data is secure, that if there's information, even things that they're printing at home, if that's maintained in their home, that you've thought about what are the appropriate protocols for how their home office is maintained and stays safe. Particularly if you've got employees who maybe are living with roommates or have other people within their homes, you just want to think about that. I think we've always thought about, you get up from your desk and maybe you lock your computer, and that's a safety protocol. Like, is that a requirement even for a remote worker? Maybe it needs to be. And if it is, how are we communicating that to our employees? Because I think some of those things maybe go by the wayside when you're working remotely. And they're things we should definitely think about. How are folks tracking their time? Can we be a little bit more flexible? Are we rigid? Is it you are online at 8 o'clock, or is there a window for which people could be online? And if you've got hourly employees, tracking time becomes a necessity. So what methods do you have for that? Are you using some type of web clock? Are you tracking it based on how they log into the system? Like, there are things that IT could probably coordinate with you to be thinking about. And we know employees that are remote, just like employees that are working in office, they may have concerns. So from a just best practice standpoint, we want to make sure that we've got means to resolve issues if folks have those, and whether that's just the normal means of going to HR, or if there needs to be something different because you've got a remote environment. Just things to be thinking about so that we can address those concerns in a really timely manner.
Okay, we made it. We got through the 5 secrets. We kept it pretty high level, but we're going to dive deep with some of the questions that we've been submitted. So let's get going. And I invite people to use the Q&A function. If a question comes to mind as we're talking, put it in there. I'm monitoring it. We'll address it here live if we can get to it. All right. This one came early on. So Lacey, you talked about the buddy system. We implemented it at Xenium. You've been a buddy yourself. Hone in a little bit more on that. One of the questions we had was about, how do you logistically set it up, and how do you go about assigning the right buddy or a mentor, whatever you want to do for new hires?
Yeah, I think you need, a few individuals who are going to kind of lead the charge on the communication. So first step is getting communication out to the organization that we're interested in doing a program like this. I think most companies are going to start with volunteers. So asking for volunteers who would like to, if you're an existing employee, here's what it means to be a buddy, right? Like defining what that looks like. What's the time commitment? What's the frequency that you're meeting? What are the expectations in terms of what do you even talk about in the meeting? Maybe even giving some ideas to those new buddies so that they, have some tools to go out into this new relationship with this new hire. I think that would be nice, but usually I've seen it start with volunteers, and I've also seen it where managers might nominate an employee. So I think you would be a really great buddy. I'd like to encourage you to think about this program, and that could be a way to generate interest. The clients that I've seen that have implemented programs like this, there has not been a shortage of people volunteering. So I actually got waitlisted. I've asked to volunteer and had to wait until we had a new round of new hires that came in. But there was tools for me to use and some ideas in terms of go to lunch, go to coffee, and we could expense it too, which was nice. So the company was investing in us building that relationship together.
This question could really be for all of us here. So the question's about learning styles. We all learn a little differently. And so like, how does your organization or your clients that you've worked with handle training and development programs in a remote environment when everybody has sort of a different learning style?
It's a good question. I'll go first, but I definitely want to hear from both of you. I think we have to have variety. So I think we need to have things provided to employees in a live format so that there can be this vehicle of a Q&A sort of session. I think recorded trainings, when you have the resources to produce those, can be really effective and less time consuming for the presenter. So you're not having to say the same thing every quarter for all the new hires. And I think you probably want to have things documented in policies and handbooks and procedures so that folks can, once they've been trained on it, they have a resource to go back to. Maybe Brandon, you can talk about something that the new knowledge base that we're implementing, because I think that could be really helpful for new learners.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. So I guess if you want to take some notes now, might be the time, because I'm going to drop a couple of technologies that really are effective. So we're implementing at Xenium a knowledge-based system to basically cut down on searching for things in email, the file explorer, all those things. And so we're bringing all the knowledge in there, and there's multimedia assets. So the system we're using is called Guru, and we're just now rolling it out. But what I'm finding is that we're adding screenshots with step-by-step tutorials. We're adding video. So in a case where I might do a training for somebody, I might record that training as a live session, but then I'm embedding the video in Guru, they call it a card. You can call it a help article, whatever you want to call it. And that video is there on demand at all times. So now I don't have to go to my manager for instruction on something. Now I can go straight to this on-demand resource at all times. A couple other things I want to mention. So recording videos, I think, is huge for training somebody else. So rather than scheduling a meeting to walk over something live, you can have it in an asynchronous fashion. So a tool I love using is called Loom, Loom. You actually can sign up for a free account. I think it's up to 5 minutes of video. So that you record your screen, you talk, you can have video on your microphone and the screen sharing. And then as soon as you're done recording, it generates a link that you can share immediately. So I find that, like, if I'm trying to show somebody something, I can just grab that link, put it in an email or a Teams chat, and somebody can kind of self-serve, and they can watch it whenever they want to watch it. It's asynchronous. So one other tool, especially if you're a process person, Scribe is an artificial intelligence based tool that you basically click go, and then you walk through a process on your screen, and it'll monitor all your clicks and what you're typing in and your screens that you're going through. And it'll literally, like, when you're done, document an entire process, and then you can edit the text, screenshots, you can delete things to make it simplified. But I find, like, how many times have you done a screen grab and typed in the text, and the process could take you half an hour, depending on how long it is. I mean, I've generated a process in like 5 minutes based on this tool. So those are two tools that I like keeping in my back pocket for training and development. Annie, maybe you have other ideas as far as like formal training and development plans, but this is a kind of a big issue right here.
Yeah, it's a big topic, and I think learning styles are very different. And so the only thing I would add, both of you had great input. The only thing I would add is just having those direct conversations with folks at the start of their employment to understand, how do you learn best? Because a lot of people do have that self-awareness, and they know, for instance, I'm not going to retain anything if I have to read a whole process, like I need to actually do it, or vice versa. And so knowing what those preferences are and those styles are up front can save you a lot of time and frustration for the employee.
That's good. All right, this next question, it's a biggie. I think everybody's struggling with this, including leaders, but how do you maintain a work-life balance while working remotely, and what role do leaders play in setting that example? I'm not taking this one.
You say that. Hands up for that one. I mean, this is huge, and I think it's an ongoing, you never arrive, right? And I think sometimes we can oversimplify the work-life balance just by calling it work-life balance, and it's different for everyone, because some people really do feel better and more on top of their work if they're checking their email periodically throughout the night. Other people, that really stresses them out, and that is not effective for them. And so again, I think it's individualized conversations. If you're noticing behaviors that seem like they could be contributing to stress or overwhelm, just checking in about how that's feeling for folks, and seeing how they're doing, asking the direct questions about, how much are you working every week? Like, what are your work weeks like? What are your work days? What are you struggling to stay on top of? What are you, what's keeping you up at night? Um, and then problem solving with folks. But I think, providing sample ideas, providing example solutions, but also trusting that your employees know themselves best and are going to be able to figure out what works for them best. I think it's just providing the space to allow that kind of problem solving to occur, and that we want to support that, and making sure that they know that that's important and an important value of your company, to make sure that people really understand that. So it has to be something part of the regular conversation.
I think that's true. Like it has to be the culture has to be that we want folks to have. I don't know if balance is even real. Like I think it's, somebody used the word harmony one time, and I was like,
Yeah.
I think that's more true, because sometimes something's going to be more personal or work. And so there needs to be, they have to work together. And if an organization is, stands for that, then the policies, the procedures, the leadership, the training that the leadership team gets, like that, it needs to be embedded like through all of those things in order for this to work. And I don't know that anybody's perfect all the time. Like I know for myself, I've got swings where I'm totally in a good spot, and other times where I'm like wildly out of sync. And for me, it's like having accountability buddies here at work that can like check in on me, and that I know actually care. So making sure that your managers, at least your managers, are playing that role with employees.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you guys, and leaders really set the tone on this. So if you have the personal value of, whether it's your family or your life outside of work, making sure that you make time for that and cut it off. I really think it's the balance thing doesn't really exist anymore. I think it's the integration, is like, how does work fit with your life? And for me, like my family's everything. So like I will cut it off regardless of where I'm at in the day. I might have to jump on later or start the day early to catch up or something, but like I will be there for my kids and my wife if that, because that's a priority. But I also realize that there's days where there's a lot expected out of me on my job, and I'm all in. Like it's either one or the other. You can't do two things at the same time. I mean, maybe some people can. I can't, and I know that about myself. So I've got to put my full attention in just making sure that like I do have like the integration, and I'm all in on work or all in on family, and it can't be both at the same time. The other thing about balance too, and maybe you two have some tips, is I will make sure to take breaks regularly. Like my Apple Watch will buzz if I haven't stood up, so I'll make sure to at least get up. But I also try to get outside, with the weather being what it is. I'm able to go for a quick walk, maybe a 5-minute walk, and just being able to just get away for a second. And I think it's encouraged, like as a leader, I talk about that publicly, so that way, other employees feel like, okay, I can do that too.
Yeah, that's important to model. And there's really interesting data on this, even just 5-minute breaks between meetings, the impact of that versus 4 hours of back-to-back meetings. There's, brain scans that show how your well-being is after two differently structured days. So the science backs up taking even just small 5-minute breaks between tasks or between meetings. I love what you said about modeling, because really leadership does set the tone for the culture at an organization. And if leadership is, back to back and not, constantly catching their breath and not able to take a break or, step away for lunch here and there, like that, people see that and then they assume that's what's expected of them. So even if as a leader in your heart you don't want that for other people, if you're modeling that, people are going to naturally assume that that's what is expected.
Lacey, earlier, I think this would be directed towards you because you talked about communication and just kind of setting expectations. But we had a question that came in that said, should we have some sort of playbook around how to communicate? Meaning, like, what tool do we use for this? Like email, chat, another form? Like, how do you go about, directing employees, or how do you think an organization should set that up?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, whether that's some type of playbook that you have that has sort of all of your remote work policies in there, how to access technology. I mean, I think you could create a pretty robust tool for folks. I think about like a new employee coming into an organization, and it's been a long time for me from being that person. But you know, you're accustomed to your old job, you come in and it's like the norms that exist that are, it's hard to even articulate those. So, and you start noticing it with a new person who like sends an email for something that like, you don't send an email for that. You're supposed to use the chat for that. And so I think that cannot be a great feeling for an employee coming into an organization. And sometimes people fail to communicate. They're not going to say anything because they don't know the appropriate means. And so I think then we miss out on valuable input and feedback and information. And so, yes, totally agree that that would be a great thing to build out. And there's a lot of templates and tools out there that with some basics and bones that you could probably build off of.
Another question that came in was, what do you recommend asking during check-ins with remote employees to gauge their well-being?
That's a good one. I think there's a lot of different directions you could go with that. I do think, you know, some of what we talked about already is, you know, just checking how it's going working remotely or hybrid, what they're noticing in terms of their engagement and productivity. We've started asking some pointed questions every month for our one-on-ones on our team to try to solicit some specific feedback. So if there's areas that you want more information on or more input on, identifying what those are and then having your leadership team all ask the same question can be helpful. But I do think, you know, honing in on this, you know, work-life integration is important, as well as, you know, do they have the support that they need, particularly if you're feeling less visibility with that person. And I really think about new employees, because I think a lot of companies learned during the pandemic, hey, we can do this remotely, and a lot of people kind of stuck with those companies through that. So they've seen the challenges, they knew what it was like before. But if you're a new employee coming in from, you know, a random state, let's say Ohio, new to the company, they're going to have fresh eyes as to what that remote experience is, and they're probably going to have some expectations in terms of how you're set up to support a remote worker. And so getting some of that important feedback from them of like, how are we doing? What do we need to change? I think is really crucial as they're getting started, so that they know that you're committed to succeeding in that model and supporting them and being inclusive.
One of the questions I love asking, and it's so simple because it's a conversation starter, is like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how you doing? Like
Yeah.
give it to me real. Because you might get some sort of like physical response as well as a verbal one. Like I know Lacey, I've asked you that. Lacey and I connect pretty regularly as leaders, and I might ask that, and if I see her kind of like giving me a smirk or something and recoil a little bit, I might be like, okay, tell me what's going on. What do you want to share? And it's just a kind of a door opener. And I think, you know, asking employees that is pretty good. But Lacey, do you have anything else that you've used in one-on-ones?
I just like asking employees, you know, is there anything that we haven't talked about that's on your mind? I think because we tend to be really like agenda driven, and so time is really valuable. We're trying to maximize our time. Sometimes you know, you only get time with your manager once a month, so you're like, I got to bang out these things and make sure that we talk about everything. But there may be other things going on, to your point, Brandon, that personally or things, you know, in work that maybe they didn't want to put on their one-on-one agenda form. Maybe they didn't feel that there was an opening. So I like asking that. And I also like just kind of leaving it open to just, you know, if we didn't talk about it today, like making sure that employees know that they can come back around, that the time with me is not just that dedicated time, and trying to make myself available and being really responsive. I think for employees when they have a need or need you, I think is important.
All right, we've got 2 minutes left, and I'm gonna pose a question that from myself that I think it's on the minds of all business owners, managers, leaders. So I'm gonna pose it like this: there are, you know, when we were in butts and seats, as Amy was talking about earlier, it's kind of easier to see what was going on, working styles, what people were working on, whether or not they're actually productive, right? Like it was just this idea that people were there and they're productive. But now you have no visibility to people's working styles, how they're operating behind their computer, what they're doing at home. Tell me some strategies around how to measure productivity or even help people along with their working styles when you aren't physically there with them.
I think this is such an important thing for leaders to be thinking about. So for me, I think it's about outcomes. So we want to have clear KPIs and outcomes for our employees. And I think have some flexibility in terms of how they get there. Your question made me think about an employee that I recently was working with having a hard time just managing the workload. Like it's some of our jobs, they are big jobs. It is a lot to do. And we actually got together. This person happens to be a local employee, so we could physically get together and spent like a half a day where they were working and I was, working too, sitting right next to them, in their cubicle, but watching them do things. And we actually found like a handful of efficiencies, little things, like even just how someone was clicking around in something to navigate somewhere, little efficiencies like that. Because I think sometimes when you're doing the work, like you don't notice your own little weird idiosyncrasies that you have. And I actually wish somebody would do that with me, because I'm sure that there are things that I could be way more efficient at. If you're fully remote in that environment, maybe it's a screen share. And I think you have to have, for that to work, there has to be trust. There has to be some kind of relationship, because I could see that feeling a little micromanagey, a little like got my thumb on you. It was definitely, there was an invitation for it and a welcomeness from the other person. But I think that could be effective and help give that person a few tips and tricks, I suppose. Annie, what would you say?
I think it goes back to that regular and frequent feedback and those direct conversations before things bubble up too big to become bigger issues. And so really problem solving, asking open-ended questions, trying to understand root cause and get at solutions that would help the individual, which are going to look different for every single person.
All right. Thanks for the input. We are actually 1 minute over. I apologize for that. But if you would like to learn more about Xenium, consume all of our content, I put the screens up with the blog, the podcast, the webinars. This is being recorded. We'll send this out to participants, and you're willing, able to share with your team. And if you're a Xenium client, reach out to your HR business partner. They're always there to ideate with you about remote work strategies. And if you're not a Xenium client, reach out. And if you want to explore the model, we're happy to have that conversation with you. Thank you for joining today's live session. Lacey, Annie, thank you for lending your expertise today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.